Hi, this is Trevor Hicken with Your Friends in the Gospel podcast. And have my brother here
Hello.
attending, Alex.
Yes.
Yeah, we're going to talk about a book he's finished about a week ago or so.
Mm-hmm.
I guess it's a couple books. What is the books you're reading or finished reading?
It's called the Saints book. Or, it's called Saints.
Saints.
I wanted to say that this podcast is not really covering the chapters. If you want to have a podcast about this book that goes along with the chapters, the church has produced a podcast, or two podcasts, one for each volume. At first, when I was reading this book, I would listen to the chapter and then listen to the podcast for covering that chapter. And yeah, it was very interesting. So I'm going to be talking about the book very generally, maybe talking about some stories.
Yeah. So the book is History of the Saints, or sounds like.
Yeah, it started before Joseph Smith was called to be a prophet, and the second volume ends slightly after they dedicate the Salt Lake Temple.
You said more than one person wrote the book?
Yeah, the podcast has good people that they have people that written the book participate in the podcast, and there's a lot of historians that have studied the the records of these people, and they try to they cross-reference and make sure the stories and the record is accurate as much as possible.
Mm-hmm. Do they cross-reference the journals with other major events or like other people's journals to verify accuracy?
Yeah, the church also had a bunch of publications as well. So it's not only personal records that they relied on.
That makes sense, yeah. So it's like about, 1815 to... When was the Salt Lake Temple finished? Dedicated?
I don't know.
Like 30 years span, or...
Well, it took them 40 years to build the Salt Lake Temple itself. So the span must
at least 70 years.
Yeah, it's... I don't know exactly how long it is. It also talks about like the experience that they had when they were celebrating the 50th year anniversary of some women's organization.
So maybe it's about 50 years, and that's pretty cool. So the characters, how do they play a role in the story?
Well, the story is not what you'd normally expect, I don't believe. It has many people's perspective and stories. It doesn't really cover one long story over the thing. It tells the development of the church from many different perspectives and how they contributed to it.
Okay. So you're more focused when you're reading, you probably see the history of the gatherings and when they're traveling to the westward towards Salt Lake, and
yeah,
just not based on different characters. I mean, you might be in for a period of time, maybe with the Smiths family, and then later with some random people just going across the plains or something.
Yeah, I think when people read it, they might be confused because it seems to bounce around sometimes. The transition between different perspectives is very sudden, I think.
Yeah, that's interesting. So, do they have anything that they focus upon? Is it more history driven, or is it like teaching principles?
I think it's the history driven, and also they made a emphasis on making sure they testify of Jesus Christ and talk about how the prophets' lives, they lived their lives and they were called of God. One thing is that they do not try to modernize. They try to represent the perspective at that time the most accurate as they can, because the perspective of that time is completely different from our time. They talk about how it's kind of interesting because the women, since Utah was a territory, they worked directly with the federal government, and a lot of the suffrage movement, there was a time when they were thinking, oh, maybe we just work on getting our rights to vote just at the local level. But in Utah, there was no local level. They work straight with the federal government because the federal government chooses their leaders. And the women of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints played a very key role in the suffrage movement. They did a lot of political work, and people would be called to be political representatives of the church. It's interesting.
Nice. Is there any underlying theme you wanted to talk about that goes throughout the stories, maybe?
Yeah, one thing that I thought was interesting is that the church, one of the biggest focuses of the church is not to just be a church where people go and attend, but they were actually establishing a kingdom, and they would gather in specific cities, and people from all over the world would come and gather. It's like the kingdom of God versus the kingdoms of the world. Not really kingdoms, but their communities. They would feel threatened because the saints were gathering in their city and voting, and the strength of the local political voices were reduced. So there's strife between the local people and the kingdom of God, and the saints were driven from city to city until they had to leave the whole United States itself. Even when they left the United States, the United States thought that they might try to raise up a rebellion against the United States with the Indians or people, but they're always trying to join the United States and make a state, and they had a United States territory for a long time. It's kind of interesting because their focus on building the kingdom of God was so much a focus of their political and thought processes that they didn't really assimilate into the political system until after the probability of them actually being accepted was a lot more realistic, because they weren't really willing to accept Utah as a state until Wilford Woodruff said that they don't encourage plural marriage.
So they strived for unity for the United States by wanting to join them?
They strive for unity?
Yeah, with the United States.
Yeah, the Saints, for a very long time, they didn't trust the United States government because They pled for their support because of the religious persecution at that time, but none of the leaders, they had many representatives try to talk to the president of the United States or the local governor and try to get people to defend their right to practice their religion, but none of them supported or protected their rights. They didn't really respect the United States. And yeah, you know the Mormon Battalion where they asked for people to join like the Mexican War. A lot of people didn't want to participate in that because why would they support the government that never supported them? But the prophets saw that this is an opportunity to start developing a relationship with the government.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Didn't they were also leaving the families they had established, so wasn't that kind of a concern, I guess?
What?
Because when the ones that were asked to join the Mexican War,
a lot of women had to lead families without their husbands because many were called on missions or they went into the military in that specific period of time. They never really had established homes and communities for very long until they established Salt Lake City. Nauvoo actually became like one of the largest cities in the United States, but they had to evacuate that city as well.
So, any of the underlying topics or themes they presented in this, or that you found in it that you thought were interesting?
This book doesn't hide anything. Basically, any record that they have that has good evidence, they talk about it. Even the bad stuff, they don't dance around that. And there's people's mistakes. There's people that they come with intentions that the prophets think they would be good people to serve, but they actually are given roles and manipulate the saints. And it's people do people things. It's kind of intense how the second volume, it seems like the majority of it, they talk about plural marriage. This book, it's really easy to find faults in people. And if you're looking for like excuses to not believe in the church, it's pretty easy to find people's mistakes and stuff. But
yeah,
this is also a powerful testimony of the prophets that they are called of God and how God establishes his kingdom. It talks a lot about people trying to take over the church, but the apostles led the church a lot of the time, and sometimes they took time to choose the next prophet and establish the new first presidency. But I want to make sure that you feel my testimony and the testimony of the saints at that time, because many of these records testify that Joseph Smith and Brigham Young and all the prophets like John Taylor and Wilford Woodruff were chosen of God, and they never led the saints astray. They were led by Jesus Christ. He is the leader of this church, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Do you have any thoughts about the books that were like maybe surprising, or do you enjoy it? Was it long? Or
yeah, the perspective of that time is pretty unique. They're a lot more bold way back then, and Brigham Young was he was so influential, and it was intense. He would like, there's this one girl that was like crushing on this guy, and they're like super good friends, and the guy is called to go on a mission, and the girl like wanted to marry him, but she can't really just say to him like, oh, let's get married before you go on your mission or something. That I don't want to be like dealing with other guys or dating around or anything while you're gone, because they could be gone like 4 or 5 years or whatever. And Brigham Young knew that the girl wants to marry him, and he just told the guy like, oh, marry your girlfriend, or this good girl that you're good friends with. And he's just like, and the girl is like, what do I do? This person told my boyfriend to marry me, and like like, oh, just grab your best dress and go get married. Yeah, Brigham
That's
Young
crazy.
established many cities. He is so influential.
But didn't he did go to the mission after getting married anyways? Or how was that?
Yeah, he went on a
How'd that
mission
work?
after they got married. It was like
Mhm.
they got married, and then the next day he like left on his mission.
That's a hard way to get married.
Well, I think people would rather want to be married than have to wait for him to come back. And he was like, oh, I don't want to deal with other guys possibly dating me or trying to convince me to date them or
Yeah.
anything like that.
Well, I guess you're married, so it's
There's a lot of people that joke about Dear John letters. Like, oh, this girl, she committed to wait for me, but she was convinced by somebody else.
yeah.
I believe that if we modernized the perspectives of the people, it would definitely not represent the times well. The people back then, everybody knows, and people joke about, or maybe they are misunderstanding about polygamy, or they try not to use the word polygamy. They say plural wives, or they prefer to use that phrase.
Mm-hmm.
People nowadays would probably think that the people would not want to consider having plural wives, but it's kind of interesting. There's a story of this girl that didn't want to marry this guy because the guy was not willing to practice plural wives. Back then, they believe that it's part of the kingdom and God was never going to change because it was a commandment of God. And this might be really confusing, but yeah, none of the prophets really wanted to practice plural marriage. Joseph Smith procrastinated until he felt he was disobedient to God. It's very interesting because they felt that it was freedom of their religion to practice plural marriage. And back then, the government was trying to outlaw having multiple wives, and there were no documentation of it, so they couldn't just say like, oh, you have document proof that you were married to these people, so we're gonna like put you in prison or something, or fine you. And then they put out the law that you can't live with unlawful cohabitation of more than one wife. And they started putting saints in prison, and it's really hard on everybody because there's so many people that they're like ripping families apart, and a lot of people had to go into like run and hide.
Wow.
For them, they felt it was part of the kingdom of God, and it was part of the freedom of their religion to practice it, and that's how they fought to keep the practice. They fought to keep the practice from because the government were trying to stop them, because most people want to only have one wife. They feel that is more true to how normal people should live. There's a lot of people. The women would organize themselves. They played, like I think I said that before, they played a powerful role in the establishment of suffrage, and they did not have anything against plural marriage back then. But nowadays people would think like, I would never want to do that, or there's a lot of women nowadays that would not even entertain it or think it was a mistake or something like that. But it was part of their life and part of the kingdom back then. It's a very different perspective that you'll be exposed to when you read or listen to the book.
Yeah. So, books, would you say you'd recommend for people to read or listen? Is it a good starting place, or would you recommend them to kind of learn church history first? Would you?
I think that it'd be good for anybody to read. I don't think it's like super deep and overbearing. It's written to be read by anybody.
That's good.
Yeah, it's a very powerful book. It shares the testimony of basically everybody. There's some enemies that don't really have testimonies, or I don't know, but it's a good testimony of Jesus Christ and his kingdom and the leaders.
Yeah.
It's nice because you could not only, a lot of times we just read what people say, but it also covers what they did.
It's awesome. Do you have any concluding thoughts about the books?
I think the learning about people's lives and how they endured life strengthen your life, because you may think that nobody can relate to you, but people have lived for many years, and situations may be similar that you could relate to, and it'll help you learn how to live and live the gospel of Jesus Christ. Yeah, the record or book represents the perspective of everybody pretty well, and trying to respect the time period as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it'd be good. I would just, with the many perspectives, you need to be very open and not judgmental of people's being very open.
Does it give context into what's happening in the U.S. history? Because maybe people would want to like, oh, at this time, maybe the colonies were gonna have like a civil war or something. I don't know.
Yeah, it does talk about that. It was saying, yeah, Joseph Smith did prophesy about the Civil War, and there's a lot of people that were converted to the church because they saw the prophecy being fulfilled. And it wasn't just like a couple years before, like anybody could see it, but it was like 10 or 20 years before where people didn't even imagine it, but it was what he prophesied actually happened.
Yeah, that's amazing. That's cool. I think that give more insight to new readers or listeners because a lot of us listening they're probably from the US and have some concept of what happened in the US history through like middle school and high school, so could help set the tone to what's happening.
Yeah, I thought it's interesting how New York seemed to have the same culture since like at least 1830. They've always been busy business people, and they were too busy to stop or talk to anybody and just do their business. Joseph Smith visited there, and he found it really hard to talk to people because everybody was so busy doing their own stuff.
Yeah, the East Coast is busy. Come to the West Coast and people will talk to you.
Kind of. I think one time I went to San Francisco and I may have like said something or asked somebody for help and they're like ignored me.
Well, I think that sums up the interview in the book summary or book review, I guess Alex has presented. Anything else you'd like to say before we end this podcast?
Yeah, the book is very insightful and faith building, and I would encourage you to also listen to the podcast alongside of it. If you read it, or I don't know how long you want to have this in your life, but I think it's good to, it's like reading the Book of Mormon nonstop. If you listen to one chapter and then listen to the podcast, and it makes the influence of the book last longer in your life. They said that the book, at the beginning they'd say this book, when they released it, they said that the book is like really hard to put down because it's written so well. But yeah, I'm a little slow reader, and I kind of enjoyed having the influence of the book longer in my life by listening to the chapters and the podcast. So I'll put the link to that in the podcast notes. And yeah, the book is free. Just download the
that's good.
Gospel Library app and you can find it there. And the voice acting is kind of good. It's kind of funny because the voice actor only has so many voices, and sometimes you hear people have the same voice but they're different people. And he's like, yeah. But he's a good voice actor.
Nice.
Yeah, thank you for listening, and I hope
thank you
that you'd consider listening to the book and let the faith of fathers influence you by listening and reading this book.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and guess I'll catch you later.
Yeah. Talk to you later. Bye.
Bye.